Welcome to Psych Psychology University. I'm Alexa Elliott. Thank you for being here. Today I'm speaking with Lee Ross. Lee Ross is the Stanford Federal Credit Union Professor of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. A renowned and frequently cited social psychologist, Lee's work has focused on areas including decision-making, conflict resolution, and attributional biases. His books include, co-authored with Richard Nisbett, Human Inference and The Person and the Situation, and co-authored with Thomas Gilovich, The Wisest One in the Room, How You Can Benefit from Social Psychology's Greatest Insights. On this episode, Lee shares insights on the often overlooked impact of circumstances on people's behavior and on how we can harness wisdom to better orient ourselves towards others, social situations, and our own outcomes. Psych welcomes Lee Ross. Hi Lee, welcome to Psych Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Lee, your field of study and research is social psychology. It's a basic question, but I'm wondering if just to start us off, you can give us a definition of what social psychology is and focuses on, and whether it's really as simple as simply studying how people behave when they're around one another.
Well, of course, social psychology is concerned with how people respond when they're in face-to-face interactions, but it's really broader than that. It's about how people respond in social contexts more generally, and so that would include everything from how we respond to each other to how we respond to the things that we write, the things that we communicate nonverbally. It relates to social structures, everything from small groups of friends and neighbors or families to things as large as societies and cultures. In fact, one of the interesting preoccupations of social psychology has always been the influences that we see in cultures and in groups that are not simply the sum of the individual beliefs and abilities of the people in them. The notion that there are differences that at a group level or even at a societal level that influence our behavior all the time. And the most obvious of those is the way we respond to norms. Even when people aren't around, even when other people aren't around, we kind of think about how other people are likely to see us and how we would see other people who are acting or achieving the way we're acting or achieving.
Much of your work has focused on some of the tension and the differences between how people perceive their relationship to the situation and their environment and how they perceive the relationship of others to their situations and environments. One of the concepts you focused on is the fundamental attribution error. I read a fairly, I think, unsophisticated definition of it, and I'm hoping that hopefully you can give us a more holistic one. But I read a definition of the fundamental attribution error that says it has been described as the tendency to believe that what people do reflects who they are. Now, I think everyone would pretty much think, how else could you judge who someone is or what they're like other than on how they behave? They might have a personal concept of who they are, but how will other people understand them other than their behavior? Can you give us a more sophisticated, I'm sure, definition of the fundamental attribution error and tell us where we go wrong in judging ourselves versus other people?
The term, the fundamental attribution error, was one that I coined in trying to capture what I thought had been a consistent lesson that 50 years of experimental research had taught us, and that is that people are more responsive to features that discriminate one situation for another and more responsive to small changes in situations than we normally recognize. And because we're not aware of that, we tend to take actions and outcomes at face value. Good behavior, good person, brave action, brave actor, silly behavior, silly actor.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to, failure means the person lacks ability, success means they have ability. We tend to, as I said, to take these things at face value and not appreciate sufficiently how much the situation matters. Details about the situation matters, and for that reason, we fail to appreciate how much changes in the situation can change behavior in people who we think we know well. Part of it is the fact that we typically encounter people in specific situations or within specific roles, and so we have a hard time distinguishing the actor from the role. Again, that leads us to some erroneous predictions and erroneous judgment about people. And it's a particular feature of kind of Western individualistic Protestant ethic culture that we place a great stock in the notion of personal and personal accountability. And that plays into this tendency. There is we hear a lot of sayings like, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. The notion that somehow or other people should overcome adversity and just get on with life and behave commendably. The other part of it, of course, that my colleague Tom Gilovich has studied is that we tend to be particularly insensitive to advantage and especially disadvantage. Especially advantage. Most of us have a pretty good sense of the obstacles that we and other people face in life, and we make some allowance for that. But we don't normally fully recognize the extent to which advantages that some people enjoy, including sometimes us, how important those advantages have been. Most of us are aware of things like that we were fortunate to have, if we were so fortunate to have had loving parents or to have grown up in families that had sufficient financial resources and a measure of security. We tend to be aware of things like that. We tend not to be aware of the extent to which being in the right place at the right time is important in the outcomes that we achieve in life. We tend to underestimate or underappreciate the importance of kind of mastery of what we might think of as social intelligence, knowing how to act in a particular situation, partially because we're fortunate we've witnessed other people in those situations and we've gotten help. So, but the general notion of many, many years of social psychology has been an increasing appreciation of how much situations matter. But we can oversimplify that. Situations matter, of course, but where the individual actor comes in most importantly is, of course, we respond to situations as we perceive or understand them to be. And two different people may respond to the same situation differently, not so much because there's a difference in the small details of that situation, but because there's a difference in how they understand or interpret it. So if someone looks askance at us from across the room, do we consider it an insult, or a slight, or do we just think they were looking somewhere else? And a lot of things will determine what we bring to the situation, what experiences, what theories or beliefs we have. Our whole history tells us about other people and their behavior. So we sometimes say that social psychology is about the tension between two important truths. One is the truth that people respond to the social situations they're in, and the second is that the responses that people have to situations depend on how they understand or define those situations.
That's funny that you wrapped it up like that with that mention of tension, because in preparation for speaking to you, that's where I've sort of been struggling and not quite knowing how to formulate questions and how to formulate the discussion. And that's part of what fascinates me, is that tension between individual personality and how much it is truly ingrained or unalterable, and the larger environments and circumstances throughout people's lives that interplay with whatever is initially naturally there. And I was going to say that what you've described sounds like such a compelling claim for compassion and reflection and understanding, but I'm wondering if it follows somewhat the law of diminishing returns. For example, you talked about pressuring people to take full responsibility for all their outcomes, pick themselves up by their bootstraps. And I'm wondering if there's any data that indicates that to some degree that's helpful to people. Like, if you do have that ethos and you do somewhat put that pressure on people, that it actually does have a positive effect and can help them have better outcomes. And if understanding people almost too much can fall into excuse making sometimes.
Well, you might make a distinction between understanding yourself and understanding other people.
Okay.
So all things being equal, it's a good idea to be compassionate and understanding, and to realize that other people's behavior is a reflection of the situations they're in now and the situations that they've been in the past that influence how they see and understand the situations they're in now. And that's a cause for not just compassion, but a kind of wisdom. The wisdom involves appreciating that sometimes, instead of replacing people who are not succeeding, we might look at what we can do to improve the situation for them. So that's relevant to how we deal with other people. In terms of ourselves, there's no doubt that there's pretty good laboratory evidence that a kind of mindset whereby we think that what we achieve is due to our own efforts and the strategies that we use, that serves us well. If we take responsibility, we try hard to overcome situations. That can involve anything from seeking help to learning more. These, particularly in education, the work of Carol Dweck and many, many other psychologists suggest that where people are most likely to persist, to show grit, and to succeed if they feel that their lack of success at any particular moment is not due to something fixed and immutable about them, but it's learning and coping as a continuing process in life, and that we're best served not just by determination and more effort, but by sometimes stepping back and saying, what can I do a little differently? But having what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, and she uses that term. So a child in school who thinks they're just smart kids and dumb kids, that child is going to be motivated, if they're succeeding, to avoid any task that's really difficult because they don't want to be shown up, and if they're not doing well, to give up. Whereas a growth mindset sort of treats achievement in school and achievement in other domains in life more like the kind of view we have about physical fitness, for instance, where we know, well, the more we exercise, the more fit we become, the more exercise we can bear, and we get better and better. And there's lots of things like that. If you're a writer, you learn that by writing a lot, you become a better writer. I guess if you're an interviewer, you learn that interviewing a lot makes you a better interviewer. You don't just say, I either have it or I don't. You say, you treat failure as a learning experience. and you take on harder challenges because those are the ones that help you grow. So there's no doubt that the kind of theory you have about what determines your successes and failures can matter. And as I said, all things being equal, it's probably best to be very compassionate about other people and to try and be compassionate about yourself. In other words, not make overly harsh judgments prematurely, but also not to let yourself off too easily and to hold yourself to fairly high standards, and not just in terms of whether you succeed or fail at particular tasks, but whether you act in ways that are consistent with your values and act in ways that you would regard as commendable if you saw them in other people.
Why does the ego, when you mentioned having a growth mindset, why does the ego seem to need such protection, and why is it so hard to open up your ego even if you find yourself not getting the results you want in life, and you're starting to come to the conclusion that it might have more to do with you than other people, and you're starting to allow those thoughts in? But why does the ego need such protection when it can be so counterproductive for people?
Well, of course, protecting the ego, you're using a psychoanalytic term, but that's not inappropriate. Of course, we all are motivated to see ourselves as two things. One as positive, that means moral, virtuous, competent, etc. So that's one motive. And the other is to see ourselves as coherent or consistent, to believe that we have a core, and that core is characterized by values and understandings that are reflected in our behavior. And that's one of the reasons why when we confront new and difficult situations, it's likely to be very challenging, because we want to behave in ways that continue to reflect not just positively on ourselves, but to continue to be consistent with our view of ourselves.
Okay.
And sometimes that can be hard. We all protect ourselves. It's just a question of how we protect ourselves. And again, it's better to protect your ego, if you want to use that term, by developing your skills, by thinking hard and long about what kind of behavior is most consistent with your values. If that's what you mean by protecting the self, of course, it's a positive thing. If what you mean by protecting the self is rationalizing and justifying and reducing dissonance and not taking responsibility, then of course that's harmful.
What's the better term? What's the self-concept, a personal identity, what used to be called the ego? What's the more correct concept now, and what does it cover?
Well, I think the idea of a self-concept is pretty good, because it doesn't have the connotation that ego protection did, which is the notion of ego protection, as Freud used the term, generally focused on the ways in which your thinking becomes distorted in order to protect your self-esteem. And I think you want to get rid of that negative connotation and just to say we all try to behave in ways that reflect well on ourselves and reflect well in terms of how other people see us, but also reflect well in how we see ourselves.
So it's difficult to change who you are, to change your behaviors, to change your patterns of thinking, because consistency in behavior and how we present ourselves is so... I didn't realize that was something that was so important to us. And as a social psychologist, you're the perfect person to ask, why is self-consistency so important? Does it have something to do with group trust and group dynamic?
Well, there's been this long history of research and discussion about that issue, about whether somehow or other we are deeply motivated simply to be consistent, or whether we're motivated to feel positively about ourselves. The way it came up in social psychological research was a period in which psychologists studied what's been called cognitive dissonance. And the great insight here was that although most of the time we try really hard to act in ways that are consistent with our values and our beliefs, sometimes what we do is the opposite, and that is we are inclined to change our beliefs or our values or our attitudes to be consistent with how we've acted. And you remember a little earlier we talked about the fact that sometimes we underestimate how much we and other people respond to relatively small changes in situations. Well, one of the things that psychologists have documented over and over again is that if we change people's behavior in subtle ways, a little bit at a time, their attitudes and beliefs will track that, and they'll come to adopt attitudes and beliefs that are consistent with their behavior.
Mm-hmm, okay.
So if you behave a little worse, you come to justify bad behavior. Behave a little better, you come to rationalize or justify the good behavior by deciding that you've been acting in accord with values.
Can I sort of just briefly segue to how this applies to personal motivation for personal goals and desires in life? Do your thoughts and attitudes drive behavior, or does behavior drive your thoughts and attitudes? Is one much more effective than the other?
Well, both go on. The point I was making is that under many circumstances, we consider the situation, we think about how we, when I say how we should respond, what response will move us towards our goals and away from things that are negative. That's the way we normally behave. But we live in a world where there's all kinds of influences on us all the time. And there's also a process, as I said, whereby we reflect on our behavior and we say, well, given that I'm exercising a lot, I must believe in exercise. Now, you may be exercising a lot or not exercising a lot, depending on whether you have a buddy to exercise with. So that may be a very important factor. But once you're exercising a lot, you will come to feel that that's an important value for you. And that's great. If you're not exercising at all, even if it's because you have no one to exercise with or no place to do it, then you're likely to decide that it's not important to you, just the way you would about someone else who you see not exercising. And you may even begin to rationalize and justify why that's true. You may have a theory like, well, there are just some people who are body people and some people who are mind people, and I guess I'm someone who cares about the mind, not the body. And you may even start to have negative views about people who exercise too much, to see them as narcissistic and shallow. So we're engaged in a constant back and forth that pertains very much in political domains too. There may be many things that make us behave in ways that look more liberal or more conservative, but once we're behaving that way, we tend to justify that behavior and move a little bit in our political beliefs to be consistent with that. So it's no accident that in general, people who pay high taxes and want to do everything they can to lower their taxes and therefore come to have a positive view of tax shelters tend to not only be conservative, but to see themselves as conservative and come up with good reasons or justifications why conservatism really is the right ideology, the one that serves the country best.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you're someone who's not being well served by society right now, you tend to be a critic of that society, and you may become a radical on the left, you may become a radical on the right, and you'll increasingly justify those views and act in ways that are consistent with those new views, and the more you act, the more your views shift. And that's what we've seen going on in America.
Mm-hmm.
We see increasingly a division in society between the so-called coastal elites and the people who are sometimes characterized as the folks who've been left behind. And so we see fairly radical political shifts.
You mentioned reflection, and I did want to use that as an opportunity to, of course, bring up wisdom and your book with your co-author, Tom Gilovich, The Wisest One in the Room. But just the last element you spoke of there, that's another area of tension that I'm intrigued by, and I don't know how to reconcile, because there also at the same time seem to be, I want to say have to be, objective ways of being that can be objectively shown to be better for everybody more consistently. So there's a tension there between that and this malleability and potential for flux in people's positions. I'm just wondering if, speaking of the American political climate at the moment, I'm wondering if the tendency towards subjectivity as opposed to objectivity I'm wondering if that pendulum has swung too far. What do you think about that?
Well, a lot of people have been offering exactly that opinion. Let me just start out saying that I never claimed that all opinions or all beliefs are equally valid or equally fruitful. I'm just saying it's inevitable that people who disagree think that their views are more realistic than the views of the people they disagree with. And this notion of, as it applies politically, is something that's worth some hard thought. There's a famous saying in Buddhism that the opposite of a truth is a falsity or a lie. The opposite of a great truth is another great truth. So we say we are alone in the world. That's profoundly true. And saying no man is an island. That's also profoundly true.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of wisdom involves thinking really hard about what are the ways in which both those things are true at the same time.
How have you... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, and so we if we think about liberalism and conservatism, and I use conservatism with a small c, that there are aspects of conservative philosophy, if it's real conservative philosophy, and liberal philosophy that are in a healthy tension.
Right.
And it's inevitable that we swing back and forth between them, and one or the other becomes exhausted in its use over time. But what we are seeing now in American politics is an embrace of what's sometimes been called postmodernism, which is getting past the notion of there being an objective truth and that wisdom involves the search for that truth, that on both the left and the right, there's some tendency now to say, well, what matters is people's lived experience, and that everybody has a different reality and they're entitled to act on and pursue that reality, and that what you feel is that it's politically legitimate to proceed on the basis of what you feel and what you subjectively believe, and not be overly concerned with facts. So the most compelling examples have to do with the tendency sometimes we see for people on the left and people on the right to not be particularly swayed when things they've been saying are proven to be wrong or untrue. So what happens is when we hear about, on the left, you hear about a policeman shooting someone, and it conjures up all your memories of race discrimination, of racism in America and police brutality, and then you find out that in this particular case, the suspect really did have a gun, or at the very least the policeman had a very legitimate reason for believing the person had a gun. And if you're on the left, you might dismiss that and say, well, that doesn't matter because lots of other times in the past, policemen have shot innocent victims, and there's lots of policemen who don't care, etc. And we justify that. And we see it very much on the right with all these terrible charges that Trump made about Hillary Clinton, and people on the left where, to describe conspiracies and misdeeds, and one after another would be debunked. But the sting remained because people on the right felt, well, these are bad people and they do bad things all the time, and it doesn't matter so much whether the particular bad thing that they were accused of doing is true or not. They're those kind of people, and I don't care about facts. And we see that that it's dangerous, and the beginning, any kind of political rapprochement in America would demand that people approach difficult issues by recognizing that many issues are complex and there's more than one side to it. So if you look at something like immigration, it isn't immigration's good, immigration's bad, anyone who opposes it is good, or anyone who opposes it is bad, is on our side. And you might start to say, well, what is a wise policy on integration? What have we seen happen in countries that have had periods of high immigration versus low immigration? And did it matter whether the economies were good or bad at the time? And did it matter whether the immigrants came and spread out over the country or congregated in small communities? And did it make a difference whether the places they moved to had low-cost housing and jobs or not? To treat issues in such a way that instead of simply saying, what side are you on? Are you on our side or the other side? To first say that facts and history are relevant. Mm-hmm. And secondly, to say that sometimes it's a good idea to try things out and learn from experiences.
I won't bog you down in postmodernism, and I was going to ask you.
Thank you.
Yes, and I also won't. I'll have no comment on the. I'll be diplomatic and have no comment on the idea that postmodernism was a search for truth, but
it wasn't a search.
Exactly.
It was a response. If you want to be serious about it, it was a response to the way in which the notion of an objective reality almost always involved the notion that there was an elite group, and the elite group defined what was reasonable or rational, and anyone who disagreed with that position somehow or other was defective or deficient in some ways. And so it was a challenge to hegemony, a challenge to the right of some educated, well-situated elite to dictate what truth was. And so that's the origin of the struggle.
In there, though, is a tie, an implicit and initial tie to Marxism. They're so intertwined. The idea that there has to be an exploitative class, there has to be an exploitative group, that there is simply no other explanation for things being the way they are. And I think this underpins so much of postmodernist thought
Well,
and work.
If you don't want to digress more seriously into postmodernism, I don't think we want to digress very seriously into Marxism, except to say that the most for this discussion, the most relevant feature of Marxism is it argued that there was an inevitable direction to history, and that history moved towards something. That it had an end in the sense of a goal. And much of American and Western European history was a question of whether the goal we moved towards was one that Marx and the Marxists defined, or were we moving towards a kind of mix of democratic capitalism and welfarism, whereby the goal of a modern society was figuring out how to get all the benefits of frictionless capitalism and then distribute the gains that came from it, the efficiencies, in a way that was fair, that it produced ideally more equality, but at a very minimum, improve substantially the position of the least fortunate. And so that's been the dominant political question of the last 100 years, really. And for a very long period of time, there was this sense that what Fukuyama called the end of history, but what he meant by that is that that's what history was moving towards, this kind of democratic society where things kept getting better and better. People had to work less hard. They had more and more security. And the last 15 or 20 years, really, even going back a little earlier than that, has seen a dramatic challenge, a dramatic change. And for many people, life was started getting worse. And when life gets worse, people try and recapture what they've lost, and that's been the dynamic in contemporary politics. There is no longer this sense that we inevitably are moving towards a life that will be better for each generation than the generation before, and everyone's struggling to come to grips with that and define what our political agenda should be.
So, Lee, you're saying that you don't want to have a 6-hour conversation where we just get bogged down in Marxism? Just kidding.
I don't want to have a 6-hour conversation in which we actually pay a lot of attention to what Marx actually said, because he was one of the most boring writers that was ever produced.
Just a quick return to, I think you've said probably everything you care to on it, but do you have anything you want to add about that kind of, the rise of the kind of radical importance and emphasis placed on subjectivity that you mentioned? An example you gave a while back, I'm just wondering, how an individual who hears about a police shooting and immediately applies their own memories and associations and experiences to that occurrence, I'm wondering how they would feel if they were in some kind of unfair situation where they were on the receiving end of assumptions, but people tried to make the argument to them that your individual experience in this case doesn't really matter because, we get it right most of the time. It seems to me that there's a fundamental hypocrisy there in that this way of viewing circumstances, I'm giving myself leeway to apply it to others, but I wouldn't apply it to myself, even though I claim to be valuing my own subjectivity above all else. It's kind of weird.
Well, again, I think some charity is called for. The starting point is to recognize that two people confronting the same situation aren't really in the same situation if the backgrounds that they bring. So an interaction between a white policeman and someone who stopped for a traffic violation is not the same experience. If you're a middle-class white person driving a nice car, you think if you've been pulled over, the policeman probably pulled you over either because you've broken the law or because there's some equipment malfunction. So you're going to say, yes, officer, what seems to be the problem? And you're not going to assume, for instance, that the police officer is just looking for an excuse to run your driver's license through some database to see if you have an outstanding warrant. So, now that's true. Now, the policeman also, when he has that interaction with a black or a white motorist, and again, especially if it's a black motorist in a part of town that has had a high crime rate, that policeman may well be pulling the person over. The reality may be different, but even if it isn't, even if he's pulled the person over because there's a broken tail light, the person who's been pulled over is already thinking about all they know about all the past interactions with that person's had with policemen and his family and his neighbors, and the policeman already is thinking about all the interactions other policemen have had. So it isn't the same situation. And I'm just saying charity demands that we understand that what appears to be that there's a certain objective situation really isn't defined simply by what happened in that situation. So we have to have some respect for the fact that subjective interpretation matters a whole lot. I'm just saying that after the fact, however, we really want to spend some time and energy trying to understand, well, what did the other person think? And why did they think what they thought? And is there something ideally that can be done to change those ways of thinking or immediately perceiving things? So there isn't a solution. We do live in a society where there's racism, and that changes the meaning of every interaction. But at the same time, as I said, it is important that we not disregard the facts in a particular situation, especially if we're making a judgment of what we should do about it. Or otherwise, we become the way, I think it was Voltaire, but I'm not sure, who talked about the Bourbon kings, who they said they learned nothing and they forgot nothing.
I promise I'll move on after this to wisdom and intelligence and the book, The Wisest One in the Room, How You Can Benefit from Social Psychology's Greatest Insights. I think it'll never change for me that these sources of tension and the search to try to find the point at which great ideas can be overly applied or spread too thin or overly exploited. I'm just wondering how it's such a contentious example, racism. I'm just wondering if there's also the possible effect of if you over-focus on certain social problems that can adversely affect individuals and their sense of self-esteem and how they can move through society. I'm also wondering if that can actually make them feel worse about themselves than they would have otherwise, and if at some point, again, it hits a sort of point of diminishing return.
Well, there's no easy recipe. I think the wisdom that my mother would have given is that in life we have two obligations. We have to try really hard not to needlessly give offense, but we also have an obligation to try really hard to not unnecessarily take offense.
So the book with your co-author, who I've spoken with, Tom Gilovich, The Wisest One in the Room, I'm just wondering to start off how you defined wisdom and what its relationship is to intelligence and being smart. I think maybe what people would sort of colloquially associate with terms like wisdom.
The shortest answer to that is to tell you the other title that we toyed with, and that was to call the book Psych.
That was a title I was considering for this podcast, for this program. Anyways, just a little coincidence.
So we said there's lots of things you can be wise about, and this book was about the kind of wisdom that's necessary for making sense of the social world that we live in, making sense of it and realizing how other people make sense of it and responding in ways that are adaptive for us and for them and for the larger society. So that's what we meant by wisdom. We really meant wisdom about social behavior and its determinants.
So of course that's different from being good at algebra.
It's certainly different from being good at algebra, but it is something that you can get better about, get wiser about over time, hopefully. We like to think that reading the book is one way to get a little wiser because then you're in the book what we said is, well, what are some of the most interesting and useful, with the emphasis on the word useful, what are some of the most useful ideas that social psychology have given us, the most powerful ideas. And we've already talked about some of them that involve the power of the situation. I think if you were to look at the particular chapter titles in our book, you get a sense of what those powerful ideas were. So we have, as I recall, one chapter, starting chapter was the objectivity illusion. That's a kind of wisdom. Starting out and saying that, yes, other people, we're all intuitive psychologists, and we look at other people, and when they behave in ways that are surprising to us, we say, what could there be about their theories and beliefs and traits that are making them behave in this strange way, that are making them respond in a way that isn't the right way to respond in that situation? We become wise about that, but it takes much more wisdom to say, oh, some of those things that influence and distort other people's judgments and decisions influence and distort our own. And we have another chapter, as I said, the push and pull of situations.
Right.
Appreciating that the behavior right now that we're observing may not be simply a reflection of character or ability. It may be a feature of the situation. And that when we see behavior that's surprising, take a step back and say, I wonder what's going on. I wonder what the situation is. I wonder how that person's interpreting that situation. Let me think about that. So we think of all the clever experiments in which people are nudged. This is a term that was used recently in that well-known book. People are nudged to behave in particular ways. So to learn when we see a lot of people behaving in a strange way, instead of saying, what is with those people? We say, what must the situation be? We have the name of the game. Well, the name of the game means that if you want to understand why people are playing the way they are, acting the way they are, you have to know what game they think they're playing. We talk about the primacy of behavior. And that's, again, saying the insight that sometimes behavior is driven by people's attitudes and beliefs, but sometimes their attitudes and beliefs are driven by the way they are behaving and the need to understand and justify that behavior. And so that's what the book was about, what are particular coherent contributions that we've gotten from social science, and how can they be applied usefully in our own lives and in as a society in adopting wiser policies. And the second half of the book is more about how important ideas can be harnessed if what we're concerned with is dealing with issues and problems in society. And I think we talk about everything from conflict and education to the problem of climate change and climate change denial.
I'm thinking of an example that you gave in your TEDx talk where you say that there are, when you're behind the wheel, there are two kinds of other people on the road. There are idiots driving too slow and maniacs going too fast.
Yeah, I said that George Carlin had that in his classic bit. He said, did you ever notice when you're on the highway, everyone driving faster than you is a maniac and everyone driving slower is an idiot?
It's an idiot.
And the point about that is, leaving the epithets of abuse aside, of course everyone driving faster than you normally think are driving too fast, because if you thought that was the right speed, you'd be driving at that speed. And the same with too slow. But that's also a metaphor for many other things about behavior on a date. Is one or the other partners going too fast or too slow in terms of the intimacy of the contact or the amount of talking about the future or even the amount of physical intimacy? And it's inevitable that each person thinks that if the other person isn't proceeding at exactly the same pace they are, it's a sign the other person is impatient or cold or whatever. And if we talked about politics, if people are moving towards social justice or demanding that we move towards social justice faster than we do, we think that they're maybe dangerous radicals or hopeless idealists. And if they're moving slower than us, we think they're conservatives or just protecting their own interests, or even they're crypto-fascists. It's across all domains we see these tendencies.
So I think
So it's meant as a metaphor, too.
Right. I think what this means for the individual to understand, again, using the metaphor of being on the road, to understand and just remind yourself that it's simply not the case that you're the only one on the road going at the perfect speed. I think what it means for us as individuals is less stress, less frustration, improved mood, which would give us a capacity in life to think about things, other people, situations, in the wise way that you're describing. I think it's important also to point out what it means for us individually to adopt these mindsets. It seems to me like it could...
Although it's funny, Alexa, on the case of the road, their behavior poses a real threat to us, particularly the ones going too fast. In many other contexts, just recognizing that their behavior mainly has consequences for them and not for us. So just chilling out a bit.
And again, the actual implications, the psychological implications of that for us personally can be a reduction in stress, a reduction in frustration.
Yeah, taking the driving example, just think of someone driving slow and you say, well, maybe that's someone who's very distracted and realizes that they better not drive fast because their mind isn't really on their driving. Maybe it's an older person who gets nervous when they drive fast. It could be our parents, or they might be driving slow right now because they're feeling a little drowsy and they realize they better be especially careful, or they may be looking for an exit. And if they're driving too fast, you want to say, well, they're stressed or in a hurry. It's too bad. I better give them a lot of distance rather than spending a lot of energy cursing them out.
I obviously was not saying that other people's behaviors can't be detrimental or consequential. I think the point I was just trying to make was, as you've stressed, an adoption of the attitude that what is the likelihood that letting yourself think that you're actually going at the perfect pace all the time. The point I was trying to make is that that's just an attitude that's actually likely to cause you more stress and frustration if you're typically or consistently in that mindset. To understand that, you might be speeding a little bit, or maybe you're in the wrong lane for the slow rate that you're going. Just to understand that there are probably little adjustments that you could make as well.
The thing there would be to be attentive, a little more attentive, and say, wait a second, am I the only one going slow? Am I the only one going fast? Wonder why that is. So learning to pay a little bit of attention, not to be the person who says, look at that, I'm watching the cadets and my son is the only one who's in step. Everyone else is out of step.
Why does wisdom seems to be so tied to experience over time and then reflecting upon our experiences over time? Why does wisdom seem to have to come with time? Why can't we get it when we're young and early on in life and it could benefit us?
I think you made exactly the right point. The point about experience is that the older we get, the more we have had opportunity, first of all, to observe ourselves in other situations, to observe change in ourselves, to observe change in other people. And so you come to learn about the importance of a situation a little bit by seeing what happens when situations change. We also observe ourselves as a young person, as an older person, as a teenager, and we've basically been in more situations and can appreciate those. When you're old, you can remember what it was like to be young, or even if imperfectly. If you're young, you don't know what it's like to be old.
Okay, Lee, we've been chatting for over an hour, so I'll let you go shortly. Can I just ask you one or two more wrap-up questions?
Sure.
Thanks. Lee, I wanted to ask you, on a slightly different note, how predictive is people's past behavior of their future behavior, and how can we influence someone who's not seeing right now that their current actions they may come to regret in the future?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of components to it. So obviously there's some tendency for people to feel that they should be consistent over time, and it's hard. Particularly if our behaviors had consequences, we want to justify it. It's very hard to say simply, well, that was then, this is now. When big changes occur in society, we tend to think that the way we now see things is the right way to see them. And even when we're aware of change, we always tend to think that we're responding the way the situation demands, and sometimes we even say, well, I used to not be objective. I used to be too impetuous. I used to be too conservative, but now I've gotten it right. So we sometimes even make judgments about our past selves as if we're a different person, and we've gotten it right now, and we're intolerant of other people who haven't joined us and gotten it right now.
Even if they feel a way that maybe we felt in the past that we recognize.
And we may be especially harsh in our judgment of people who continue to feel the way we used to feel when we think it's no longer appropriate. So that can be, of course, a classic charge about liberals, that today's,
if you were a liberal, if you were
progressives who behaved a particular way in 2005, but don't behave that way in 2015, are inclined to think that there's something wrong with those folks who are just changing at a slower rate than they are. Just think about how often, with regard to all the gender issues that are out there. And you talked about wisdom. It's one of the things when you're old, as I am, is you remember the past. I remember a time when the newspaper had ads that said, all ads said employment wanted male, employment female, and some of them had male or female, but they certainly had no one thought there was anything wrong with that.
Now, you mean that the job was only open either to males or females specifically?
Well, it wasn't exactly that. It was not considered inappropriate. Say, here is a job for men, here is a job for women. Mm-hmm. An employer certainly had the right to only hire women or only hire men. And in fact, looking back, a lot of those employers were correct in their assumption that things will run more smoothly if everyone's the same. Mm-hmm. It just happened not to be fair. And there is a tendency, and this is actually that gets into a whole, there is a tendency among liberals and conservatives to think that what they think is right is also what's efficient.
Really?
Yeah.
People tend to tie their...
Let me take a trivial example.
Okay.
In research on capital punishment, people who believe that capital punishment is a just punishment for murder, right, also believe it deters potential murderers. People who do not support capital punishment think it's not a deterrent. To some extent, of course, they don't support it because they think it's not a deterrent, and vice versa. But if you ask them, and this is research I've done, the people who think it's a deterrent and support it say they would support it even if it wasn't a deterrent. It's just a matter of just punishment. People who oppose it say, I don't care, even if it does deter potential murderers, it's immoral to take a life.
And they're assessing it as a punishment on
right.
other bases other than just deterrence.
Diversity say, I believe in diversity, and a diverse workplace is more efficient and more productive and more innovative, etc. That may or may not be true, and the answer probably is sometimes it's more productive and sometimes it's not more productive. And you want to separate those two. So I don't know if you've seen the wonderful podcast that Malcolm Gladwell did on Brown versus Board of Education.
I had not that specific podcast,
okay.
No.
So one of the things that Malcolm did was to say, essentially, look, Brown v. versus Board of Education was a disaster for the black kids who were put into white schools. Historically, it was very important. It was necessary. It was certainly justified. But if you simply said, were black kids who were moved out of a school where they were being taught by black teachers who loved them into a white school where they were being taught by white teachers who didn't love them and parents who hated their being there and fellow students who resented their presence, were they better off? And the answer is no. That for integration to have worked the way the best hopes were, they would have had to move black teachers into white schools. And they made bloody sure that they didn't move black teachers into white schools because that would have created too much political controversy. But as I said, there's a tendency for people to not be willing to say that sometimes doing the right thing is going to cost us something, but we should do it anyway. We should make the sacrifice. Now, it's better if we're saying we should make the sacrifice than that someone else should make the sacrifice, but there is a tendency for people to keep insisting that, remember I talked about consistency?
Yes.
We want to believe that the things that we think are morally right are also efficient. So people who believe who cherish America's democratic traditions and believe we ought to be a sanctuary for all and be open borders, they think that immigration produces a net economic gain. People who think that immigration is not an obligation think it's a drain on society. And they're not open to the possibility that, well, maybe it's a gain in the short run and a loss in the long run, or a loss in the short run and a gain in the long run. Lots of things are complicated, and the striving for consistency makes people at all points on the political spectrum want to assume that the world is a much simpler place and a much more coherent place than it really is.
Lee, I want to talk to you about wisdom and these general principles that you outline in the book, but you keep bringing up political specifics, and then something ticks in my mind, and I have to just present a little little counter.
The times, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And what you made me think of there is that I think people in general do make more distinctions than in your example. I don't know that there's a popular sentiment in the United States that immigration is a net loss or a net burden. I think people make distinctions that legal immigration of people with certain characteristics or abilities or credentials may have this result, and other types of what now falls under the word of immigration. And again, there seems to be sort of a loosening of these terms and their meanings, but that the movement into the country of other people is an economic burden.
I think you're right. And two things. First of all, one of the tendency that I'm describing partially occurs because people don't normally, under many circumstances, acknowledge ambivalence. They think depending on who your peer group is, they think that if you acknowledge the complexity of an issue, that you'll be suspect, that you'll be shunned. And on immigration, just to take that example, I think you're probably right. Most people in America understand that, I won't even say it's the right thing to do, the only policy that could possibly win general approval would be to say we have to control illegal immigration. Country has a right to determine who can and cannot come into the country, and at the same time we have to provide a path to citizenship for people who are here, and that this might be a little less agreement, but as a moral society we have to do our share to deal with refugee problems around the world. And there are reasons why people on the right don't want to concede that we have to solve the problem of providing a path to citizenship, and people on the left don't want to concede that we probably have to gain control of the policy. And then there are specific measures like saying that employers should not be allowed to hire people who are undocumented, that if we can make people who are currently undocumented have a legal right to work, then in future we can say that you need a document to work. So there may be many policies that everyone understands that if there were a solution, this is the only solution people could agree on, and the majority might even agree, but it may be politically very, very difficult to achieve because there's a tendency to say if it's something that the other side is proposing, anything, then we have to oppose it.
Lee, you must be very wise because you're so able to articulate the shortcomings and the benefits of both positions, of opposing sides, and especially now ones that have currently become so contentious. Do you feel wise?
Do I feel wise?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I feel otherwise.
But do you feel at this point in your life, do you feel A particular sense
Well,
of wisdom?
okay, a serious version of that question is, so after you've done all this psychology and all this study and all this reasoning, do you feel that it makes you wiser?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say every error and bias that Tom and I describe, I am still susceptible to, but I think if I allow myself to reflect and to not respond too quickly, then it can be a corrective. And in general, the secret of wisdom in terms of the kinds of things that Tom and I wrote about is to sometimes just take a moment to stop and think, to ask yourself the question, that was my initial first response. Is that if I think about it more deeply, do I come to a different judgment? Do I come to a different decision? And so a lot of being wiser, it does involve a willingness to avoid quick judgments and to think a little more. Another is related to something very deep about time perspective, and that is particularly where it's a moral or ethical issue, to say, okay, so that's my initial response right now. I'm saying, that group did this bad thing, now nuke them. And it's, well, wait a second. If you had asked me about that when I wasn't angry, if you had asked me about it a year ago, to think about it in terms of your more general views, would you have said the same thing? And even more importantly, to say, okay, imagine looking back on this 10 years from now. Would I be proud of that response, or would I be ashamed?
That's such a good point, and such a good question.
Yeah, so we have a little bit about that in the book, where we talked about the so-called righteous Gentiles, these farmers, these Frisian Dutch farmers who saved children during the Holocaust, and what characterized them. And what characterized them, one of the things that characterized them is that they said, this is a kind of test, and I want to think about how I'll look back on this 10 years from now. I don't want to just put my head down the way my neighbors are and think only about what I can do tomorrow to get by. Now, people who think about what they can do to get by are often the people who survive, and the people who engage in more moralistic thinking may be at a disadvantage. But society depends on there being a certain percentage of wise people who say, I'm not going to get caught up in the moment, and I'm going to say, what are the principles that are governing my behavior?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go there, but say to be more Kantian in our thinking, to be able to say, what is the general principle that I'm adhering to in this judgment or in this decision, and would I defend that general principle if it was not me, if it was someone else, or if it was a slightly different situation. So a lot of those things are aspects of wisdom, and it involves just basically, and maybe we can end here, is asking yourself the question, is what I'm about to do wise? Is the judgment I'm making right now a wise one? Is it a fair one? Is it one that reflects on me in a way that I would look back on and be proud of?
Lee, thank you so much. And what that element of time perspective and principles makes me think to say in closing is that the reason those things are so important is because there simply will always be people who are in different points in time in their lives, and who will be in different points in their accumulation of wisdom. So we have to ask ourselves these,
yes.
Right, these
I
these
mentioned
questions.
Buddhism before. Another tenet of Buddhism if you think of life as a journey, there are times that complaining, being angry when things are bad, or overly joyous when things are good, is equivalent to being on a long trek and cursing because right now you're going up a hill, or rejoicing because right now you're going down. It's okay to do that, but understand that the journey will always have hills and valleys.
Lee, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you on the program, and thank you again.
Okay, well, enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening to the program. I'm Alexa Elliott. If you enjoyed the show, please tune in next Thursday for another episode of Psych U, Psychology University. Until then, take care.